Just trying to check something. Sorry about that. Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha Shelach, Tavshin Pei Hey. We will be starting at Perek Gimel, chapter 13, Pasuk Chaf, verse 20. Now, Parsha Shelach is primarily dedicated to the story of the spies. And the Parsha begins where Hashem tells Moshe, send for yourself spies to spy out the land, a man per tribe, a spy per tribe, goes through the names of the spies, and then the Torah relates Moshe's charge to the spies what they're supposed to do. And of course, they're looking over the land to see what the people are like, what the land is like. And in Pasuk Chaf, verse 20, Moshe says to the spies, Umaha aretz hashminahi. What is the land like? Is it fat? In Raza, is it lean? Meaning, does it produce fruit? Hayesh ba'etzimayim, does it have fruit trees or not? V'hiz chazaktem, you shall strengthen yourselves. Actually, I take that back. When it says, is it fat or is it lean, means is it fertile or is it not fertile? Does it have a tree, meaning does it have fruit trees? If not, v'hiz chazaktem, and you shall strengthen yourselves, ulakachtem pri haaretz, and you shall take from the fruit of the land. Vayamim yimei bikurei anavim, the days were the season of the first ripe grapes. So Moshe tells them to bring back from the fruits of the land. Right? It says, you shall strengthen yourselves and you shall take from the fruits of the land. And we know that later on, if we look a little bit further, which is on Pasuk Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Chaf Gimel reads, Vayavayu ad Nachal Eshkol, they came to the Eshkol Valley, or the Eshkol, I think they translate it as the Eshkol Valley, yeah. The Eshkol Valley. They cut up from there a branch, the Eshkol Anavim Echad, one cluster of grapes. They carried it with a pole with two people. And they brought from the pomegranates and from the figs. So we see that they actually did so. The Torah talks about Moshe told them to bring the fruits, and that's what they did. So if I were to ask you, why did they do that? Why did Moshe tell them to cut down and bring from the fruits of the land? Why did he tell them to do that?
To make people happy.
What do you mean?
They maybe they scared.
No.
Maybe they are not ready to show. Finally, we go to the land with.
So what is the fruit going to show them?
Grapes.
Yeah, what's that going to show them? What are they supposed to see with that? What was the purpose of bringing these grapes to show the Jewish people?
What's purpose?
Yeah. Now, we also know, as we will mention later on, that these grapes, this cluster of grapes, was very large. And the pomegranate and the fig were very large.
But this is just plus. It's not so bad.
So what's the point of it?
But this is...
So
no point. This is a clear point. We finally go to the land.
Okay, but that's what do I have to bring the fruit for? Why do I have to bring their fruit? They're spying out the land. They're checking out the land. Why do I have to bring back fruit?
Why they bring back?
Yeah, Moshe told them.
Yeah,
you shall strengthen yourselves and bring from the fruits of the land. Moshe tells them to bring fruits of the land. Why? What's the point? So I always thought that it was more like Moshe Rabbeinu knew that the fruits of Eretz Yisrael were very special. And when they'll bring back the fruits of Eretz Yisrael and show it to the people, they'll see what kind of amazing fruits it is. That's going to show them how great the land is, and it's going to increase their desire to go.
And they're going to impress.
Yeah, impressing them about the land.
Better than description.
Right. So, that's what I always thought. However, the commentary of the Sefornu, and actually what's called the commentary of Targum Yonis and the Aramaic commentary of, it's called the translation, Aramaic translation of Yonasan, they actually say that the point here is like this. The point is I'll read the words of the Sefornu is on the words, V'schazaktem l'kachim priya aretz, you shall strengthen yourselves and bring from the fruits of the land, lahachzik ba. That means to take hold of it. You're cutting down the fruit and bringing it back to lahachzik ba, to take hold of the land. V'altiru shitnu einayim bachem l'meraglim. And when you cut it down, you may be concerned that the people are going to wonder, why are you cutting it down? And Moshe says, don't worry. And I think that's how the Sephorna explaining what it means, strengthen yourselves. Don't worry that it looks kind of odd as to why you're doing this. Because they're not going to think about, don't worry, they're not going to look at you as spies for doing so. But the point of bringing the fruit is lahachzikba, to take hold of it. And the Targum Innocent also says the same thing. V'sabdun cheskasa, you shall perform a chazaka, you shall perform an act of taking possession, and you shall bring from the fruits of the land. Now, what does this mean? This means the following. If you want to buy a piece of land from me, you want to buy real estate from me, a piece of land, right? So the Torah, halacha, has certain means of acquisition that we do. One of the means, one of the means of acquiring land can be if I give you money for the land, right? Even if it's not the full amount, I give you money for the land. I believe that works for Karka Nikdas Bekesav, I'm pretty sure. That's one means of going ahead and acquiring it. If, let's say, I go ahead and I write a document of sale that I'm selling you this piece of land, and I give you that document, okay? That's another means of acquisition. Another means of acquisition is to do an act in the land like an owner would. So, for instance, if, let's say, there's a fence around the piece of land, and there's a break in the fence, and you go and you fix up that break, you fill it in. That's what an owner does. And if that's what you do, you now become the owner. That's a form of acquisition. Because anytime you want to become an owner of something, you need an acquisition. And the Torah has certain specific acts of how we acquire movable objects, how we acquire land. And one of the ways of acquiring land is to make a chazaka. Chazaka means do an act of taking hold. Do an act of ownership, and that now becomes your act of acquisition. There's other ways of doing it too.
But what is different? What is different? There is what is called stealing. Why you believe this is show ownership?
What does?
To hold it.
Oh, hold on.
Maybe
You're jumping the gun here. No, that's not kosher. We'll get to it in a second. Okay, I'll hit your first question. Now, so therefore, as you're understanding now, according to the Sefer Nui, why did Moshe say cut off the fruit from the land? Because that would be an act of acquisition. That's what an owner does, right? An owner, on his land, he cuts off the fruit in order to take it. So if you cut off the fruit to take it, that's considered an act of acquisition. Yeah, sure, you could be a thief like that too. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that it can't act as an act of acquisition. Owners do that too. Owners are the ones who primarily do that. Okay. And therefore, the Sephorno, the Targum Innocent, are saying that the purpose here of cutting the fruit and taking it and bringing it, that was meant to be an act of acquisition. Not so much an act of, there could have been other things, there could have been other advantages too. Maybe you could say, why did he tell him to do this act of bringing the fruit? Maybe there could have been other things. Well, the truth is, this act of acquisition was meant to be an act of acquisition on the whole land, right? So what were they going to do? So, what other options did they have to make a chazaka? The answer, but to go ahead and cut off the fruit and take it and bring it back, that's an act of acquisition. And that is, and it's very interesting that for the Jewish people to now get the land of Israel, according to the Sephorno and the Targum Innocent, they had to actually make an acquisition of the land. And that acquisition of the land was not by just marching in there and fighting a war. The acquisition was done even before they fought the war. The acquisition was done by the spies to go ahead and cut off the fruit and bring it back. That's an act of ownership. And that was the act of acquisition. Very interesting. Which means that the spies had two jobs. One job was to spy, look at the land, bring back a report. and the other one was to make the act of acquisition of the land for the Jewish people.
What is new? This land was promised by Hashem. It's
Fine,
yours.
fine, but now you have to acquire it.
Like act.
Yeah, I have to do an act of acquisition. Now, with this, there's another interesting thing that we can explain. Going back to that pasuk you mentioned before on Pasuk Chav Gimel, verse 23, where it says, "Vayovayu ad Nachal Eshkol," they came to the valley of Eshkol, "Vayichrusu misham zemoira," and they cut down from there a branch, "V'eshkol anavim echad," with one cluster. They carried it by a pole with two, and they brought from the Rimonim from the Te'anim. Okay, next pasuk. La Makai Mahu Kara Nachal Eshkol. That place they called Nachal Eshkol. Meaning when the previous pasuk called it that, it was calling it based on what was going to be in the future. After they cut off the grape, that cluster of grapes, they now called that place the Eshkol Valley. Al Oides Eshkol, because of the cluster, Asher Karsu Misham B'nai Yisrael, that the B'nai Yisrael cut down from there. Now, the Orach Chaim points out something very interesting, and that is, when it says it was called Nachal Eshkol because of the cluster that the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, cut down from there. Who are the children of Israel here? Who are the children of Israel that cut down this cluster? The spies.
No, yes.
The spies, right? But we don't call them the spies. We call them Bnei Yisrael. We call them a name that applies to the whole Jewish people. In other places, when we talk about the spies, they're called the spies. They're called the men. They're called the spies. And here, when they're cutting down the cluster, they're called Bnei Yisrael. They're not just called the spies. They're given a description that's a description of the whole people. Says the Orach Chaim, because when they went and they cut down this branch, they were cutting it down on behalf of the Jewish people. This act of cutting down this cluster, this act of what they did here, that was an act that they were doing on behalf of the Jewish people. It was like the Jewish people was doing it. They were representatives. And we say they were shaluchim. They were the messengers. They were the agents of the Jewish people to cut down this cluster. And therefore, since this act was an act on behalf of the Jewish people, an act that was considered like the Jewish people were doing it. So the way I was going to read to you here the Orach Chaim's words. He says, "Asher karsu b'nei Yisrael," the children of Israel cut down. Pirish klalis Yisrael karsu eshkol. The Jewish people as a whole cut down this cluster. V'gam shlohu eliyud beis anoshim, although it was only 12 men doing it. Let's say hayisem shluchei kol Yisrael. We can call them b'nei Yisrael because they were the agents of all the Jewish people. Kilu karsu kol Yisrael, and that's considered as if the Jewish people cut it down. And the Orach Chaim cites another place where we find that, where it says by the Korban Pesach, the shachatu oisei kol kaladas Yisrael, and the entire assembly of the Jewish people will slaughter it. And the Talmud says the whole Jewish people aren't slaughtering a Korban Pesach. You have many people cutting down I'm sorry. The Gemara explains that the shachatu oisei, they will shecht it, really means each and every individual person will shecht. Now, does each and every individual person shecht his Korban Pesach? No. You get one person to do it for you, right? Lots of people can have a Korban Pesach, and one person slaughters it for everyone. And the Torah is that's what happens by the slaughtering. And the Torah calls it a shachatu. They will slaughter it. That's because we have a principle. Your agent is like you. When your agent does something, it's like you're doing it. And therefore, here, the cutting down of this cluster, the spies were the agents of the Jewish people in doing so. Therefore, it says Bnei Yisrael, because the point of the Torah to say is, this is considered as if the whole Jewish people cut it down. Okay, that's very nice. Why? Why did it have to be that this cutting down was considered like the Bnei Yisrael were cutting it down? Why did it have to be that it's considered? Why did they have to be agents to do this? Why did it have to be that it's considered as if the whole Bnei Yisrael cut it down? Why was it necessary to be that? The answer is that the Arachim doesn't say that, but it could very well be to explain this. The Arachim is saying this because if the reason that they're cutting down the cluster is because it's an act of chazaka, it's an act of acquisition, it's an act of taking hold of the land. Because this is how the Jewish people take hold of the land. Okay, so they are therefore agents of the Jewish people to do this. They're making the acquisition on behalf for the entire Jewish people. Now, all the Jewish people have made a chazaka, have made an act of acquisition on the land through their agents for the spot where that were the spies. So that works out very well, works out very nicely. So therefore, what we accomplished so far tonight was that we gave a new insight into what was the point of bringing back the fruits, and an explanation of this very unusual wording that's being used here, that the Jewish people, the Bnei Yisrael as a whole, cut down that cluster. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something new. Now this is really surprising. Ready for this one?
Spy.
Now here's a new one. Okay, this I never heard this until this year. I saw this. All right, we're going to go back now to Pasuk Beis. We're going to go back to verse 2, beginning of the Parsha, second verse in the Parsha. Yeah? Shlach locha nashim. Hashem says to Moshe, send men for yourself. The Yasuru es Eretz Canaan, they shall spy out the land of Canaan. Asher ani noisei livnei Yisrael, that I am giving to the Jewish people. Ish echad, one man, Ish echad, one man, Lamatea Baisav Tishlachu, for the tribe of his fathers you shall send, Kol Nasi Bohem, each one is a prince among them. Okay? Now, how many spies were there, Arkady?
10.
Huh?
10 against 2.
So how many spies were sent?
12.
12. Okay? Now, the pasuk says, ish echad, right? One man, according to the tribe of his fathers. So it was only one man. Why did it say one man? It should just say one man. No? Okay. But, you'll answer me. And this is not, and if you look in most commentaries, that's how they're going to translate it. One man means one man per tribe. It's kind of like a way of stressing. It's one person. One man per tribe means a way of saying each tribe has one man.
Yeah.
Fine. Not bad, right? Now, let's go back to Pasuk Chav Beis. Pasuk Chav Beis, Pasuk Chav Gimel, where it says, Vayavayu Nachal Eshkol, they came to the Eshkol Valley, they cut down from there a branch with one cluster, and this cluster was, they carried it, they translate this on a double pole, and they took from the pomegranates and from the figs. So the Talmud in Gemara Sota, which is on Daf, Gemara Sota, which is, right, Daf Lamedalim and Aleph 34a, explains that, even the Torah doesn't say this, but because of the certain words that the Torah says, the Talmud says, how many people did it take to carry these fruits? Did one of them take the cluster and put it in his pocket, another one put the pomegranate in his pocket, another one put the fig in his pocket? How many people had to carry this?
All of them.
Why? Because it was so big, right? So therefore the Gemara says, and Rashi brings this down here, 8 people carried the cluster, 1 carried the pomegranate, 1 carried the fig, and Yeshua and Kalev, they didn't carry anything. We're not going to get into that.
But they were somewhere else.
No, they were with them. At one point, Kalev went away and came back, but he was with them. They were with them. But the Gemara says they didn't carry. That's what we call Talmud. That's Talmud Bavli. That's our Talmud. Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, right? Which we don't. There are many people who study it, but it's not what we regularly study. Talmud Yerushalmi actually says that no, all of them were involved. But the Talmud Yerushalmi says there is an argument between, there should be, or there is an argument, or there should be an argument between the sage Rabbi Yishmael, sage from the times of the Mishnah, and the sage Rabbi Akiva. And it's based around those words I told you before that says, ish echad, one man, one man. Yeah, one man, one man. So Rabbi Shmuel says that when you, or we find in other places, he says that when you have this kind of wording, one man, and I ask you a question, let's just say one, he says, people, that's many times we say the Torah speaks like people speak, and people, when they want to say one man per tribe, they would say one man per tribe. But at the end of the day, it just means one man. So therefore, there were 12 spies. And therefore, you had 8 carrying the cluster, and between the last 4, they carried the figs, the pomegranates, and whatever vessels there were. But according to Rabbi Akiva does not say ish echad. The Torah wouldn't say it for no reason. And the Torah wouldn't say it just because that's how people speak. According to Rabbi Akiva, ish echad, one man means 1 + 1 equals 2. And therefore, there were not 12 spies, there were 24 spies. And according to him, the way the Gemara says 16 carried the cluster, and the last 8 carried the figs, the pomegranate, and the vessels.
24.
24.
But this is names.
Right. There's only 12 of them, right?
Only 12.
Only 12. Not only that, in Devarim, when Moshe, in the beginning in Parshas Devarim, when Moshe Rabbeinu repeats the sin of the spies, the wording is, Moshe says, when they asked for spies, the matter was good in my eyes, but I took from you 12 men, Isha Chad LaShabbat, 1 man per tribe.
What is 24?
Where's the 20? Where's the 24 coming from? And if it is 24, why aren't they mentioned? So, we could probably just end right now and say, it's a good question.
This is from Rabbi Akiva.
This would be what the Talmud Yerushalmi says Rabbi Akiva should hold.
There is no any like that in
No.
Bible.
No. Okay, that's what Yerushalmi says. So it's really an interesting idea. So we'll see how much time we have to get through this. But I mention often a Rabbi Emanuel Bernstein. He's a rabbi in Israel, and he says a parsha class that I listen to, and he wanted to suggest like this. Okay, so he starts off saying, right, that we just established before in the first half of our class that the spies had 2 jobs. One job was to be spies. The other job was to acquire the land on behalf of the Jewish people. They acted as agents on behalf of the Jewish people. So what eventually he wants to get at is to say there were 12 spies, and there were another 12 people who were the agents to acquire the land. Got to build it up a little bit more. Other than maybe there can be other questions on it that we could ask. What's it based on? So if you look on the Pasuk Beis again, going back to Pasuk Beis, Hashem says, send for yourself men, let them spy out the land and bring them to the Jewish people. 1 man per tribe of his fathers you shall send. Kol nasi bohem, each one a prince among them. Now, if you would just read those words, everyone a prince among them, you would have thought that who are the people they're going to send? The princes of the tribe, right? We know each tribe had a prince. Each tribe had a head of the tribe. They're referred to as Nesiim previously in the Torah. But we know that when you read the names of the spies, it's different people than the princes.
We know in name of princes?
Yeah, Parshas Bamidbar, beginning of Bamidbar. It has all the list of the names of the princes.
This is different names?
Different names. Different names. Okay? So, So therefore, some commentaries just say Kol Nasiba means each one is a prince, means each one's an important person. Each one's a leader of sorts, and their tribe. But they were not the actual princes. So Rabbi Bernstein wanted to suggest that maybe, according to Rabbi Akiva understood that at this point, now again, it gets complicated in reading into the words of the Parsha. I think you have to kind of work things out in the words. But he wants to say, Hashem told Moshe, send for yourself men, they'll spy out the land, each man per tribe you shall send, Kol Nasi Bohem, all the prince among them you shall also send. And then when it says Moshe sent them, and it mentions the names being mentioned are the spies. We don't need to mention the names of the princes. We know their names already from before. So again, it doesn't, it's not going to be the simple way of learning the words. But again, it's just perhaps an idea to work with to try to give some kind of explanation to all this. That actually, besides for the spies, you know who else went? The princes went. You know why the princes went? Because who would be the representatives of the Jewish people to acquire the land, as we explained before? The princes. The princes, they're the leaders of the tribe. They're if anybody's going to represent them, it would be them. If anybody's going to be the agent to acquire the land for the Jewish people, it would make all the sense that the princes should go. Yeah, it didn't have to be the princes. I think an argument can be made like that. However, it makes a lot of sense that the princes should be the one to do that. And therefore, you had 24 people, 12 were princes. Their job was to do the acquiring of the land, the acquisition of the land. The other 12 were to go ahead and to spy. And we mentioned only the names of the spies because we know the names of the princes already.
But in this parsha, it's the name of spies.
Right, but we don't need to have to go through the names of the princes because we have their names in Parshas Bamidbar.
But this is directly says this is people head of.
You have to break it up a little bit. You gotta have to break it up. You have to break it up. Send people to spy. There should have been the word and or something that represents and. Kol Nasi Behem is going to be another group. All the princes among them. And then when we start saying names, we only mention names of the spies because we don't need the other names. Now, so it's an interesting idea. Again, you have to try to probably work it through a little bit more, all the other verses. Now, getting to Parshas Devarim, right, where Moshe says, I sent 12 people. Why did Moshe only mention 12? Because in Parshas Devarim, why is Moshe repeating the story of the spies? Because he's reminding the new generation, he's going through that sin to learn the lessons from it. And he goes through the story of how the spies came back and the Jewish people cried. And because of that, the Jewish people stayed in the desert for for a total of 40 years. For the purpose that Moshe needed to repeat the story, he only has to talk about the spies. Because it was only the spies who related the report of the land. Those are the ones he has to talk about. Those are the ones that are relevant to Moshe Rabbeinu's point of how they gave a bad report, the Jewish people cried and gave up hope, and they ended up being punished by dying in the desert. The spies are the ones that are relevant to that. The princes aren't. Princes aren't relevant to that. They weren't there to report anything. That was the spies' job. I would even suggest, if you want to, with this whole approach, that maybe the princes, after they cut down that cluster, no, that doesn't work. No, that doesn't work. No, let's say that doesn't work. But at the end of the day, Moshe said, I sent 12 people because he doesn't have to talk about the princes. The ones whose job was to spy and report, were the spies. And there were 12 of those. And those are the ones who are responsible for what happened eventually to the Jewish people giving up hope, giving up going into the land and dying in the desert. So there, he only mentions the 12 because that's all that's relevant to the point that he's trying to bring in a Parshas Devarim.
But this is 12 also came back to the.
Everybody came back.
But why are they not involved in?
Because that's not their job. They're not their job. Their job was to do the acquisition. The spying, that was other people's job.
But this is huge.
It's not their job. That's what he wants. That's what you'd have to say, according to this. It's not their job. Their job was to do acquisitions.
But this is all people in Israel was involved in this conflict.
No, there weren't. All people were only involved. They didn't go into the land to spy it out.
But when they spy talk about this,
fine, they spoke to everyone, right?
Yeah, it means all people were like.
Well, it means all the people besides for the other 12 people who went along. They saw that themselves.
Indifferent.
They didn't say anything. They at the end of the day, right? We know the Jewish people cried. Right?
Yeah.
Which means at the end of the day, they either went along with the spies, they got convinced afterwards, or whatever it may be.
But there is no any mention.
There's no mention of them because that wasn't their job. That wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was for acquisition. Therefore, they're mentioned here, but they're not mentioned again in Shelach. I'm sorry, in Devarim, because Devarim is about the rebuke for the Jewish people did, and the responsibility of that was for the spies. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful evening.
But Caliph actually